Hello, thanks for attending my talk. The topic is Feminism in STEM, Recruitment, Bullying, and Bad Evidence from Professional Scientists. I'd like to start off by first thanking everyone who put this conference together. I imagine it was quite a bit of work considering the current circumstances. And of course, thank you for inviting me to speak. So let's just get right to it. Why am I talking about feminism in STEM? Well, I was in a STEM field in physics at the University of California, and it's my impression that there is this idea that while it seems to be understood that campus-style feminism, the type of feminism you'll find in the gender studies course, has taken over a lot of academic fields, that sciences have somehow managed to remain somewhat untouched. But I can assure you from my experience in the physics department at the University of California that nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, my experience with basically the department being overrun by feminist dogma inspired me to create a YouTube playlist on my YouTube channel, which is called Galileo's Telescope, which is a channel about mostly physics and science, but I created a playlist about feminism called The Little Pink Book that mostly looks at basically bad academic practices in academic feminism or bad research practices in general found in feminism, and how they basically manipulate statistics to ensure they get the results that agree with their theories. So if you like this talk, you might want to check out that playlist. Okay, so it's true that it's difficult for gender studies to actually get into a STEM curriculum because, let's say take physics for example. How are you going to actually stick a gender studies or gender studies ideas in, let's say, a calculus class? It's just not really that possible. But they have other ways of doing it. One way is to simply take over the administration. But another way, which is by far the most effective way, is that, at least in physics, and I'm going to use physics as the example, but from what I can tell, it's pretty much the same in all STEM fields. Well, in physics, they have created these advocacy groups for women that, they're at every university and they're pretty much always called Women in Physics, or WIP is the abbreviation. Don't be fooled by the name here. These groups have nothing to do with women doing physics. And in fact, they are basically just gender studies courses that have been or found their way into a physics department. Now, if these groups were just a bunch of women getting together doing physics, or just some social group for women, there'd be nothing wrong with them. But actually, the point of these groups is to ensure that the female students come out as good feminists, and to convince them that they are basically a oppressed class within the physics department, and that it's because of men. So how it works is, when students arrive in the fall, let's just say this. Throughout the year, there are usually maybe 3 or 4 talks about the status of women in physics, but they tend to be concentrated in the fall because that's when the students arrive, and that's when you gotta recruit them as soon as they get there. And I've been to many of these talks, and basically they all work the same way. Most of the talk is about scaring the living daylights out of the women who just arrived, and by telling them that basically their careers are doomed because they've arrived in a sexist environment that's a boys' club, and the boys want to keep it that way, and as a result, they will be actively discriminated against, and their careers will be sabotaged by these boys who don't want the women there. And that's just the least of it, because If they're nice to you, then you really got to be careful, because they might just be luring you in to eventually take sexual advantage of you. Okay, so now that these girls who have just arrived are terrified, in the last 15 minutes or so of the talk, they offer them salvation. They say, yes, it's horrible, but don't worry. If you join women in physics, as women, we can stick together and we can overcome, and your dreams will come true. Here's the thing, though. The same professors that are putting a lot of energy into spreading this message, both to the women and to the men, because they want to shame the men for their patriarchal attitudes towards women in the physics department. In the spring, when those same students were visiting and hadn't actually chosen which school they were going to join, the message is the complete opposite. In the spring, the message is the university is a wonderful and supportive environment. We'll make lots of friends that will last a lifetime. You won't just be some student. The professors and the administration genuinely care about your well-being, especially if you're a woman, because the university takes great pride in having female scientists. So clearly, I think I've just demonstrated that this story, this patriarchal story about physics being a boys' club that's out to sabotage women, is not even believed by the people spreading this message. Because if they really believed that the environment was so bad for women, and that, say, 1 in 5 women who came into the university would come out having been sexually assaulted, they would never be doing all this promotion of their program, or all this outreach to, well, basically high school girls, so underage girls, encouraging them to come to the university while secretly believing that a quarter of them are going to be sexually assaulted. So clearly, nobody believes this, especially the people spreading the message. If you want to know a little bit more about how this process works, I did create a video in that playlist called Campus Advocacy that goes into a little more detail on how this works. But what happens is all the women join, because really what the message is here is join women in physics or else. Because if you don't join, then you're viewed as a traitor to your gender, traitor to women. And that's exactly what happens if you don't join. I only know 2 women who didn't join, and they both told me that the female professors who were heavily invested in women in physics both went out of their way to let both of them know that they were disappointed in their choice not to join, and that they basically were, traitors to women. So most of the women join not because they have a problem with men, but because they just don't want to be, or they want to be part of the social group. You don't have to be very observant to know that if there's one thing young women don't like, it's being socially excluded. And that's what will happen if they don't join. So in this talk, I'm going to go over some of the main pieces of evidence that are put forward to supposedly support this claim of physics being hostile to women. Right, so the 4 main ones are anecdotal stories of poorly behaved men, low numbers of women in the department, unconscious bias, and imposter syndrome. There's a 5th one that's often talked about, which is sexual harassment, but I'm not going to talk about that. Well, for one thing, it kind of fits into the horror stories, the anecdotal horror stories category, but that's more of a campus-wide tactic of spreading feminist ideas, and it's got its own set of problems, and I'm not going to talk about it. I'd like to emphasize that in this case, all of this so-called evidence is presented by physics PhDs or scientists, professional scientists and tenured professors. Unlike, say, if you weren't in a gender studies department, There, the evidence is presented by people who actually don't really know how to do research. They don't have any proper training in statistics or proper research, so they can kind of hide their faulty evidence behind the fact that they're not really, it's not really reasonable to expect them to be competent researchers. But in this case, these are competent researchers, and they can't hide behind that. I also have a video on basically all of the tricks of the trade by feminists to ensure that whatever research is done always agrees with their theory, with their theory of patriarchy. And it's probably good to be familiar with these because, you can say whatever you want about feminists, but one thing is they're really good at what they do. Okay, so first piece of evidence, anecdotal evidence, which has been rebranded as lived experience because everyone knows anecdotal evidence is not really valid evidence. This basically speaks for itself, all right? It's just anecdotal stories about some poorly behaved man somewhere. Now, the thing is, these stories are never about a man in the department. I've never seen a talk where actually there was a professor that everybody knew that was the poorly behaved professor. They have to search the news, in the entire country to find a handful of supposedly poorly behaved men. Usually they've just been accused, but, maybe some of them actually are poorly behaved. And then say, you see, there's this problem because we found so many in the news, but, they had to look in the entire country to find them. They're never the men in the room. So there's this culture against women, but these men that are perpetuating this culture are never present. They're, somewhere in the ether somewhere and nobody can find them. A really common tactic is that the presenter will ask the women in the room to raise their hands if they have ever, and then they, insert bad experience with a man. And of course, every woman raises her hand because, every woman has had a bad experience with a man or met a man who was a jerk. So, everyone raises their hand. And this is taken as evidence. The argument is, look, all these women have had a bad experience with a man. That is therefore evidence of a hostile environment towards women. Now, these are scientists, so they make sure to do their due diligence and proper research and have proper controls. So they also ask the women how many have had good experiences with men. And of course, they all raise their hand because most of the men in the department are very well behaved and very supportive of women. And then they ask the men if they've had bad experiences because you got to make sure this is actually a female targeted thing. It's not just, every human being has had something happen to them. No, I'm just kidding. That never happens, all right? Never are there control groups. And this is going to come up over and over again. They just ask how many have ever, and that's really the key. It's not how often does it happen, it's have you ever. Well, of course every woman has had a bad experience with a man because every woman has probably encountered thousands of men in her life. And so it's inevitable that from time to time she'll meet a jerk. You could do the same thing with men and ask about women. How many men have ever met a woman who chases men with money? Or how many men have ever met a woman who they would call crazy? Probably every man will raise their hand. Does that mean we live in a culture of crazy gold diggers? No. It means that there's a lot of women in the country, and men meet a lot of women, and, you meet enough women, occasionally you're going to meet a crazy one, or a one that's a bit of a gold digger, even if they're very rare. You can think of it like, how many people have ever seen a Chinese baby in the United States? Probably everyone. Well, Chinese babies are actually quite statistically uncommon, but everyone sees one probably on a somewhat regular basis. That doesn't mean we live in a culture of Chinese babies. Okay. Next piece of evidence, underrepresentation of women. The argument goes as follows. Women are 50% of the population. They're less than 50% of the people in physics. Therefore, women are being discriminated against. Well, this is just logically false. What they're saying is, if women are discriminated against, that would result in lower numbers of women in the field. Since there are lower numbers of women in the field, we can conclude that women are being discriminated against. It's just wrong. It's a logically false argument. In fact, I once asked the presenter, who had just given a talk that was basically entirely based on this argument, I asked her, why are you using this as a standard when you and everyone in the room knows it's just logically wrong? And she answered me, well, yeah, I know, it's not actually a sound argument, and it doesn't actually prove that there's discrimination, but it's a good first approximation. Okay, this is typical physics talk, because physicists love first approximations. In fact, most of physics is based on first approximations. The problem is, it's not a good first approximation. It's just logically false. Statements that are logically false are not approximately true, or are not, to a good first approximation, logically true. They're just false. And as if to prove my point, right after I asked that question, a professor raised his hand and started to point out that there are more women on campus as a whole than men, and before he could even finish his sentence, the whole auditorium, which had probably a couple hundred people in it, went up in groans. So everyone in the room understood this was just completely faulty logic, but nobody groaned when the presenter was using it because it gave, the acceptable outcome. Right, so more than 50% women on a university campus does not imply discrimination towards men. This argument is also used to claim that the physics GRE is discriminatory towards women because the average score on the physics GRE of women is slightly lower than the men's average score. But again, you could do the same logic with grades, where girls tend to have higher grades than boys, and nobody's doing that. So one thing that happens here a lot is that they're claiming something to be true in a STEM field. But actually what they do, if you pay attention, is they just pull from maybe one STEM field. So commonly they'll pick physics because there's few women there. They'll claim to have found some pattern there. Then they'll jump to saying we found a pattern in STEM, even though they only sampled from physics. Once they've established this is a STEM effect, they then jump to saying this is something we found in education as a whole. And then once they've established it's part of a problem in education, they say this is a result of societal-wide biases towards women. So this is really astounding because they sample from a tiny corner of the population, which is people in physics, extrapolate to STEM, then extrapolate to education as a whole, and then extrapolate to the general population, with no justification for that. And remember, these are professional scientists, people with PhDs doing this, and nobody ever has a problem with it. Another thing with STEM fields is, because the definition of STEM is somewhat vague as to what counts as a STEM field and not, they can just throw out fields that don't suit their theories. So, for example, medicine, psychology, and social science do fit the apparent definition of a STEM field. They're rarely considered. And when dealing with gender, even though biology is pretty much universally agreed on that it's a STEM field, when dealing with gender, it's very often excluded. And I'm going to show you why. Here is a plot of the most common majors the most common majors in the United States. So the first one is business, but the next four are health professions, so medicine, social sciences, psychology, and biological sciences. So those four, which are excluded from STEM fields, are the largest STEM fields by population, and they're all predominantly women. So, yeah, if you throw them out, you've just thrown out all the women. So it's not really a surprise you're left with low numbers of women. Basically, STEM is being defined in practice as fields with low numbers of women in order to then claim that there are low numbers of women in STEM. So we can see here, if you include other fields that fit the STEM definition, well, we actually have 50-50 men and women. So on the left here, we have various STEM fields, or STEM fields broken up into various categories, and you can see some of them are mostly women and some are mostly men. So this graph shows the fraction of women in the field. And when you put them all together, on the right here, we have the yellow line and the blue line are men and women, fractions of percent or numbers of men and women, and they've been the same for the last 20 years. In fact, they've probably been the same since the 80s. So, yeah, if you throw out, going back to the plot on the left, if you throw out psychology, which is the black line, and then you throw out biology, which is the red line, and you throw out social sciences, which is the orange line, you've just thrown out all the women. Okay, this is about the replication crisis, but I think I'm going to skip it because this is taking a little longer than I expected. But basically, this just says that there's been a recognized problem that a lot of psychological papers can't be replicated, like somewhere between a third and 1% to about 1% have never been replicated. When you try to replicate them, only about a third can be replicated. But I'm not going to go much into this except to say that most of these problems come from basically social priming type studies, which include things like unconscious bias and imposter syndrome, which are the next two pieces of evidence that I'm going to look at. Okay, so unconscious bias. What is unconscious bias? Basically, it's this theory of psychology and behavior that we all have, or we all experience in our subconscious, slight little cues from society or from the culture around us that we don't really notice, but then cause us to behave in discriminatory ways or biased ways towards different groups of people. It's very important to know, or to note, that this theory is very far from being accepted by clinical psychologists. It's highly controversial. In fact, from what I understand, most psychologists don't really think this is a very sound theory. The most popular way of measuring unconscious bias, there are a number of ways of measuring it, but the most popular test is the implicit association test, or the IAT. And this test has mountains of papers finding problems with it. It's unclear what it's measuring. If it is measuring something, it's unclear how to interpret it. So you have this problem where opposite biases can give the same result, and that's been demonstrated. The test itself is not reliable, meaning that if you give the same person the test multiple times, the correlation between those two tests or the test and the retest is very low. And it's not valid, meaning it doesn't predict behavior. And most importantly, there is zero evidence whatsoever that results from the IAT correlate to real-world discriminatory behavior. None. Now, when this is presented in a physics talk, for example, They never say any of this. All they do is they say there is unconscious bias, and that's basically it. They just talk about its existence. They don't talk about that it's controversial or anything. It's basically talked about as if this is hard science and completely agreed upon by all psychologists. But they don't tell what the results of the tests are. They just say it exists. And then it's implied, because unconscious bias exists, everyone is unconsciously biased against women. Well, the problem is, even though this test has all these problems, or this theory has all these problems, there is one exception, possibly, which is gender. Because the one result that has been found numerous times, replicated numerous times, using multiple methods of testing, not just the IAT, is that everybody is biased in favor of women, or shows unconscious bias in favor of women, especially women. This has been dubbed the women are wonderful effect, and social scientists and feminists have been bending over backwards for basically 30 years now, trying to somehow reinterpret this as bias against women. So basically what they're trying to do is somehow find a way to argue that the subconscious tendency to be biased in favor of women is evidence that people are biased against women. So, as I said, it's been replicated numerous times, and it's been replicated cross-culturally. Not only that, cultures that have stronger gender roles show the strongest women are wonderful effect. Meaning, the more a culture tends to have strict gender roles, the more they tend to think women are wonderful. Almost as if gender roles were put in place by societies in an attempt to benefit women. The effect can be moderated by some things, like if your relationship with your parents. So if you have a good relationship with your mother or your father, you tend to think good things about the gender of your mother or your father, depending which one you have a good relationship with. It's also been shown that people with active sex lives tend to think good things about the opposite gender, which shouldn't really come to much of a surprise, but it probably does maybe, well, I'll let you speculate on what it might say about the sex lives of feminists. And here's the kicker. Not only do they find that people are pretty much universally biased in favor of women, with an asterisk that this unconscious bias thing can be reliably measured. So there's a big asterisk on this. But to the extent that you believe it, this is the most robust result that does exist in the theory of unconscious bias. But so not only are people unconsciously biased in favor of women, but they found that men lack the mechanism to be unconsciously biased against women. Now, I don't really understand how they conclude this because I'm not a psychologist, but from what I gather, it's basically that men do not have a psychological mechanism for viewing themselves as part of the group men. That's not a category they identify as, where women do view themselves as we're part of the group women. Men will have groups, they'll identify with their other groups that might be predominantly men, but they're rallying around something else like sports team or race or, political party or something like that. So not only are people not only is anyone showing unconscious bias against women, but men who are supposed to be the most biased against women aren't even capable of doing it psychologically. I'd like to point out that you've probably heard of, if you've heard of unconscious bias, you've probably heard of unconscious bias training. And recently, a meta-analysis of 500 papers looking at the effectiveness of unconscious bias training has found that it has no effect. It does not affect behavior. It does not in any way reduce discrimination or biased behavior, and it doesn't have an effect on results of the IAT. And one of the authors of this paper is one of the creators of the IAT. So he made his career initially on the IAT, and he's saying unconscious bias training doesn't work. So, whenever you hear this stuff in a department about unconscious bias training, at this point, I would argue it's maybe the largest pseudoscience of our time. Now you can see why, when they present this stuff as evidence of this discrimination against women, they never tell you the results of unconscious bias testing, because they're actually the exact opposite of what they're trying to claim. Okay, imposter syndrome. This is by far the biggest one. If you go to any Women in Physics website, I guarantee you will find all sorts of stuff about imposter syndrome. They talk about this all the time. So the theory of imposter syndrome, or the idea, is that a person who has imposter syndrome, let's say they're a very qualified person, but they believe, or they are worried that actually they're not as qualified as, say, their resume says they are, or as the people around them expect them to be, and it's only a matter of time before the qualified people they're working with are going to figure out they're actually imposters in the field. Like, they don't actually belong there because they're not actually qualified, even though on paper it says that they are. This is not a recognized psychological disease or a psychological disorder, officially. This syndrome came up with an original study back in the 70s. And this is a really bad study. They only looked at high-achieving women. So they didn't compare to low-achieving women, and they didn't compare to men, either high-achieving or low-achieving. And they found that a large number of these women had this sort of self-doubt about them belonging in this highly successful, or in this position that requires them to be highly competent. So I don't know how many times I can stress this, but you cannot claim to have measured something if you don't have a background measurement or a control group to compare to. And it's just astonishing the number of studies I've seen that do this. In fact, every talk I've been to, there's no control group. And every time I went to one, I would raise my hand and ask, why is there no control group? And everyone would look at me like I'm saying the moon was made of cheese. And these are all PhDs and tenured professors in physics. In the paper, the authors speculated that this self-doubt that these high-achieving women had was due to negative cultural stereotypes about women. They didn't do any testing to see if that's why. It's just pure speculation. Now, after this study came out, the feminists ran with it, but there weren't that many follow-up studies. But eventually, someone had the brilliant idea to maybe insert a control group and see how common this effect was in men. And by the time the 90s came around, it was pretty much agreed upon this is just as common in men as it is in women. In fact, about 75% of the people have this sort of psychological self-doubt about their own qualifications. And this is supported by the original author, right? The original author, Clance in this case, has said, by the time the 90s got around, has said, yeah, this is just as common in men. It's got nothing to do with gender. It's not even really clear it's a real thing, since 75% of the population has it. It's just normal human psychology. But by that time, it was too late. But it gets worse, okay? This is not what imposter syndrome is, according to psychologists. It is not a result of being surrounded by people of different demographic than yourself. That's not what they mean by imposter. It's imposter in the sense that you're not a qualified person surrounded by qualified people and nobody knows about it yet, but it's only a matter of time before you're found out. But the physicists, and probably other STEM field professors, have flipped this and said, and now they're using it as imposter means you're surrounded by people who aren't of your demographic. Right? This is basically just flat out invention by, I think, probably by physicists, or at very least by people who are not psychologists. So, for example, a few years back, one of the UC schools hired 3 female physicists, and they bragged about it in their newspaper. It was big news among the UC schools. And I just want to read to you what this article says. So, you can ignore this graph, it's not really relevant. So I'm just going to read what the article says here. According to the American Institute of Physics, female graduate students and postdocs in those fields are frequently hampered by the imposter syndrome. Okay, let's stop right there. Who is this according to? American Institute of Physics, not psychologists. Right? There is no reason to believe they have any qualifications to make claims about psychology. Right, then they go on to define what imposter syndrome is. And they say, the belief that they don't really belong in the scientific disciplines dominated by men, that's not imposter syndrome. All right? Nowhere in the psychological literature is that how imposter syndrome is defined. They continue, as a consequence, many women drop out before they can establish their careers as scientists, but effective mentors, particularly other women scientists, have been shown in studies to counteract the problem. Do they cite the studies? No. And here's where it really gets interesting. I'm going to quote what one of the women interviewed here was said. So this woman, White, is one of the lead researchers, I think the lead statistician for the American Institute of Physics. And she says, quote, men can also be exceptional mentors, but there is something about being someone who looks like you. It's easier to believe you can do something when they look like you. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. Women, it's difficult for women because they're surrounded by people that don't look like them. I mean, and this is said by people who are claiming to be fighting bigotry and bias. I don't even know what to say. It's probably one of the most bigoted statements I've ever heard. I can't work with people because they don't look like me. I guess it's good for the white women that there's not a lot of black physicists either because, then they'd really have imposter syndrome if they were surrounded by black men. What they don't say in this article is that White's own research at the American Institute of Physics has concluded every year for the last 10 years at least that discrimination cannot explain the low numbers of women in physics. All right, so White herself has said it, or her team has said it, 10 years in a row at least. Imposter syndrome is used as basically the main explanation for why women on average have a lower GRE score, physics GRE score than men. And the argument is they're in a room full of men, they get psychologically discombobulated and believe they don't belong there and their performance suffers. Well, this can be actually easily tested because this would mean that if you just change the demographics for the same test, the scores would change, or the gender gap would change. Also, since this has nothing to do with the test and just being surrounded by a bunch of men, the effect should also be there in different tests in which there's mostly men. Well, let's take a look at the first claim. It's true that the average physics GRE score is lower for women than men by about 10%. And it's true that women are the minority. Today, they're about 20% of people in physics. The problem is The gender gap is also there on the general GRE, and women there are the majority. In fact, the gap is larger on the general GRE than on the physics GRE. So, how do you explain that? They can't claim imposter syndrome here. On the SAT, we have a similar problem. There's a slight gap, or a slightly higher male score, and women are a slight majority. ACT, also women are a slight majority, but okay, it's a 1% difference. We might as well say there's no gap. Is anyone really looking that closely at ACT scores to down to 1% difference? And all this, by the way, is happening while the number of women in physics has increased over the last 30 years or so. By the way, if you look at this graph, which is from a paper about women in STEM, which field is missing? Biology. Okay, so first prediction didn't pan out, but maybe it's not an if and only if situation, so let's look at the next claim. If we change the test, so a different test but with the same demographics should also have a imposter syndrome problem. Well, that's easy. Just look at other tests in physics, same demographics. Well, it turns out that when you look at grades, women on average, even in STEM fields, have higher grades than boys. So what happened to imposter syndrome? It went away all of a sudden. In fact, girls have higher grades in every field or every subject at every age across the board from first grade all the way through grad school. Or actually, they have higher or equal or higher grades. So, is anyone claiming this is discrimination because girls have higher grades? No. So, what's going on? These are exactly the same demographics, and there's no effect from imposter syndrome. In fact, it's not just the exact same demographics. It's literally the same people. The men that the women who take the GRE, or the women who take the GRE, are surrounded by the same men they've just spent 3 years in college with, taking physics courses, doing their homework with, taking their tests with, taking their midterms with. They're probably friends with most of them. So they have no problem hanging out with them. Then all of a sudden, GRE, and they're psychologically discombobulated by imposter syndrome. This doesn't make any sense. In fact, it's been shown that there is another explanation for this, which is that when there's a penalty for guessing, women are slightly less likely to guess and they skip a lot more questions. On average. And if we go back to the ACT, in all of these standardized tests, the ACT is the only one that doesn't have a penalty for the wrong answer, and that's got the lowest gender gap, which is basically 0. Of course, you can't bring this up. It doesn't fit it's not the right narrative, and even though it would easily fix the problem if you just explained to these mathematically minded physics students the probabilities of guessing. So, okay, let's go back to this statement that it's difficult for women because most of they don't have mentors that look like them. Well, they do have mentors that look like them, first of all. It's not like there's no women in physics. It's still 20%, so 1 in 5 people in the department are still women. But let's pretend it's true for a second. Imposter syndrome for women would start at 18 years old and as adults. But education doesn't start in college. It starts when you're a kid. And for the 12 years of education prior to college, women are the majority of the mentors. And it's happening to children. So that must mean that the young, impressionable minds of boys have just spent, of little boys, have just spent 12 years of imposter syndrome before they've arrived in college. So they must have some, 12 years of baggage and psychological discombobulation because all they had were female teachers. So women come in with a large head start in college. Is anyone claiming this? Of course not. In fact, it doesn't explain Well, this doesn't explain women leaving the field, not only because of everything I just said, but women leave the field even in female-dominated fields. So if you look at biology here, which is the orange line, it's about 60% women for bachelor's degrees, which is the left graph here. And the right graph here is PhDs, fraction of women. And we look at the orange line, it's gone from 60% down to less than 55%. So that's a female-dominated field, and yet women are still leaving more disproportionately compared to men. So how do you explain it? You can't use imposter syndrome to explain that. And by the way, let's just note here, blue line is all STEM fields, and they've included biology here. And look, over 50% women. If you just include biology, you have over 50% women in STEM. Okay, so what is the evidence for bias against women in STEM? Basically, there is none. All right? They couldn't find any in policy. They couldn't find any in people's behavior. They couldn't find it in the language. In fact, they couldn't even find it in people's conscious thoughts. They had to resort to claiming it was in our subconscious, even though actually in our subconscious, if anything, it's bias in favor of women. And they couldn't find it using proper research. They have to exclude control groups. They have to throw out data that doesn't agree with them. And if that's not enough, to the extent that discrimination does exist against women, who's most likely to do it? Successful, high-ranking women. And who's most likely to show favoritism towards women? Old white men. The patriarchy incarnate. So, does that mean there's no sexism in STEM? Well, departments bend over backwards to hire women. They publicly brag when they hire women. They have affirmative action for women. They have advocacy groups that teach women that the men around them are basically monsters and that offer them extra support that's not offered to the men, which is a violation of Title IX. They claim that women bring in some new perspective that is unavailable to the male brain. They claim that men cannot be good enough mentors simply because they don't look like women. They claim that women are so psychologically discombobulated simply because there's men around them that they can't be expected to do their job properly. And men are generally portrayed by the worst handful of cherry-picked men that can possibly be found in the country. And all this is done by breaking basically every single fundamental rule of proper science and research and statistics. And of course, if you question it, you're actively silenced through bullying and shaming tactics accusing you of misogyny. So, is there sexism in STEM? Absolutely. And there's also quite a bit of academic fraud. So, that's my talk. Thanks again for inviting me to talk at this conference. And if you want, I have all the references to all the paper or all the figures I've cited. So, thanks again.